Well, let's return now to the issue of live cattle exports to Indonesia. Yesterday, as we were mentioning, a Labor caucus passed a motion insisting the blanket export ban stay in place until all slaughterhouses receiving Australian cattle comply with international welfare standards. But down the hallway, the coalition was on a different track. It wants the immediate resumption of cattle shipments to abattoirs in Indonesia, which have the same standards as meatworks as we have in this country. If not, it says graziers in northern Australia will either have to shoot 150,000 cattle or set them loose, which could lead to starvation on an unprecedented scale and also ecological disaster. Warren Truss is the leader of the National Party. He's in our Parliament House studio. Warren Truss, good morning.
Good morning.
Now, Australian officials have still yet to inspect all Indonesian meatworks. Why should shipments of cattle be resumed if there's no guarantee that the cattle will not be mistreated?
Well, everyone is appalled by what we saw on our television, but now the key focus must be on fixing the problem. The longer this trade remains suspended, the worse the problem compounds. What we do need to do is reward those abattoirs that are delivering good practice by renewing the trade to those, and those alone. Clearly, we need to make sure that the processes and the mechanisms and the chain is secure so that our cattle only go to those quality abattoirs.
Well, that's the issue at the moment, though, that you cannot guarantee, according to the Prime Minister, no guarantee that Australian cattle sent will end up at one of those 5 or 6 Indonesian abattoirs which have acceptable standards.
Well, we are fortunate in Australia to have a national livestock identification scheme which traces every animal. So within a day, we could have that system operating so that we could track the animals right into the Indonesian abattoirs.
Within a day?
Within a day or two. All we've got to do is put tags on the animal as they leave the country. We have the readers, the system is in place, and so it can be done very quickly.
With respect, Mr Truss, if that can happen within a day, shouldn't the Australian Meat and Livestock or LiveCorp, our beef export industry, be chastised severely for not having this in place already?
Well, we do have the National Livestock Identification Scheme in place
Not
across
for
the country. It can be used, and it has been used for a lot of the exports, but it hasn't been compulsory up till now in some of those northern cattle stations. Now, it clearly needs to be made compulsory, and it can clearly be clearly be a condition of export, so that in effect it can be done quickly. Now, we'll need to also have some people on the ground. I think industry funds should be used to help open up that chain to make sure that abattoirs are improved wherever they possibly can, and that the trade then only be open to those abattoirs where in fact we've got world's best practice.
Isn't what you've just described there exactly what the government is putting in place?
Well, but they're dawdling around about it. It has been, unfortunately, another example of policy failure on the part of the government. They've changed their mind so many times that no one knows what's going on. But what we've got to do is get these animals out of the yards. We've got to do something about the costs that are being borne, the fact that the whole industry is stalled at the present time. There's no cash flow. Many of these producers are in a great deal of trouble. Communities, truckers, helicopter pilots, shippers, they're all facing enormous difficulties. We can get it moving quite quickly, and we can do it with a high degree of assurance that only those abattoirs which meet good standards are in fact the ones to be opened.
As I said, that is the government's stated position. It's also the position from one of Australia's largest cattle producers, Paul Holmes-A-Court, who said last week when all this broke, the government had no choice here. He said, currently our industry can't guarantee our standards will be met all the way down the line, and the ban shall only be lifted once we have an independent, audible system which can allow that to happen. As I understand it, that is what the government is putting in place.
Look, I think Minister Ludwig has tried very hard to deal with this. His original decision was the right one, to ban only those bad abattoirs and to reward good practice. There was obviously interference from other parties. Now he's got it back on track, and I think he will move as quickly as he possibly can to get the trade open. I'm demonstrating to you with the plan that the coalition has put forward that it can be done really quickly and with a high degree of confidence.
Just to be clear, how many days are you saying it could be done that we could have these ordered systems in place that we can track the cattle from when they leave the station, get on a ship, arrive at the feedlots and end up in an abattoir, to ensure that they arrive at one of only 5 abattoirs up to Australian standards?
Well, look, what has to be done now is obviously to get the whole trade system working again. The whole chain has got to be reactivated, but it certainly can be done within days and not weeks or months.
Okay. The coalition is warning that the longer this goes on, animal welfare standards here are an issue because thousands and thousands of cattle are being stored in pens. They're meant to be exported. If they're not able to be exported, they are not really suitable for the domestic market here, so they will either end up having to be shot or they will end up being released into the wilderness where they could starve to death or create a lot of damage. Now, the issue is, if your call is to allow beef to be sent almost immediately to the 5 abattoirs up to standard, that's not going to solve that problem. It's only going to take, a small portion of these cattle being stored.
Well, that's correct. There is going to be an impact on the industry regardless, because it's certainly not going to be possible to move the trade up to full speed probably this whole season. Bearing in mind the season's only got a few more months to go before the wet season comes in again, and it'll be stalled as it always is until March or April the following year. So certainly there's going to be some pain in the industry, and there's going to need to be consideration for those people who've been affected by it. Particularly many of the smaller producers have got nowhere else for their animals to go, and that's going to cause serious cash flow problems. Banks are already warning of foreclosures, but it's not just going to be the cattle producers themselves. You're going to have problems with the small businesses that support them, whole towns and communities. This is the industry, Aboriginal stations in particular. This is their only source of income, and so there are going to be a lot of issues to be dealt with within Australia. But I'm not saying we can compromise on those. Now, the reality is it's unacceptable for Australian animals to go to substandard abattoirs. There needs to be a program, and the industry needs to play a role in this to help upgrade abattoirs in Indonesia. Our foreign aid program can also make a contribution, and bit by bit we can upgrade animal welfare practices in Indonesia. We've been doing things over the years. Clearly not enough has been done. There are examples of good practice that are working well, and we must build on those successes and wipe out those abattoirs from our marketplace that don't meet satisfactory standards.
Are you critical of the industry here for not foreseeing this, for not improving those standards as you just outlined there earlier? And if so, isn't it fair and reasonable that Meat and Livestock Australia accept the government's call to front up $5 million from contingency funds? It has apparently $70 million in contingency funding to help support farmers whose cash flow has been endangered by this.
Well, I certainly think that the industry must play a role and use some of its funds to help get this trade back on track. They need to be spending their money on improving the security of the supply chain and upgrading Indonesian abattoirs.
And what about compensating farmers?
Well, I can understand that the industry is upset that they're being asked to pay for the cost of what was essentially government policy mismanagement. Now,
but was it government mismanagement or was it industry mismanagement, that the welfare standards aren't good enough?
Well, the fact that the animals are being locked up without any certainty of their future is certainly as a result of paralysis in government policy decision making. As I said, the minister got it right the first time, and I think the industry could have worked through with his original policy decision. It's been changed a number of times subsequently, and so there needs to be a clarity of policy direction. I would prefer that industry funds be focused on rebuilding the trade, improving standards overseas, and the industry's got to expect to pay a big share of that cost, and I think there's an expression of willingness to do that.
Given your experience, when you were Trade Minister in the Howard government, you had to deal with the Saudis rejecting a shipment of live sheep from Australia. That export industry was shut down for a number of years. Wouldn't you expect the industry to be more alert to these dangers?
Well, the issue regarding the Saudi sheep was when I was actually Agriculture Minister. It was about the transport of animals at that time, and in particular an assurance that there was a way of unloading sheep close to their country of destination if in fact a problem arose with the shipment. Now that did result in a year's suspension of the trade to Saudi, but we were able to reach readily agreements with other countries to put in place quarantine unloading facilities facilities, and therefore the trade continued to much of the rest of the world. But nonetheless, there was an impact on the industry as a result of that. The cost of dealing with that shipment was high, and the industry's learned a lot of lessons from that. I think most people agree that the standard of shipping now is much, much improved. In fact, the ships are of good quality. The treatment in the feedlots, both in Australia and particularly overseas, has improved vastly. There was evidence of that even on the brief footage that the Four Corners program showed, that there is good quality practices, and so the industry has made progress. But that doesn't mean they're without fault. Clearly, they've got more to do, and particularly with the benefit of hindsight, they should have done a lot more faster.
Warren Truss, thank you very much for joining us.
You're very welcome.
National Party leader Warren Truss. It's 9 minutes to 8.